Clan Scryer is probably my favourite of the Skaven clans. Their combination of arcane sorcery and infernal technology has always appealed. Unfortunately, their miniature range has been a little neglected. We have newer incarnations of the bigger war machines like the Doom Wheel and the Warp Lightning Cannon, but the infantry-based weapons are still only available in metal or finecast. But I hope to remedy this a little. I'm Pete the Wargamer, and in this video I'll be showing you how to kitbash a plastic Warplock Jezzail team. To start, I began with some storm vermin. These are plastic and generally a better option to start with, rather than the lowly clan rat. Clan rats come with sculpted on left arms, which severely limits their usefulness. So I removed the two torso halves from the sprue and cleaned up their mold lines, before finally gluing the two pieces together. For the Jezzail itself, I needed a weapon that was both long and also had more of a black powder feel about it. The long rifle from the Free Guild handgunner set would have been a good choice, but I felt that the transuranic arquebus from the Skitarii Rangers kit was a better choice. Mainly because it looked a little more techy, but also because the arms that were carrying it more closely matched those of other Skaven units. However, I wouldn't be able to attach this to the torso without making some adjustments first. The first modification involved trimming back the shoulders on the arms a little. The armor plating that was towards the front of the shoulder was conflicting with the shoulder armor of the torso, so I used my knife to make a series of small trims. I periodically checked my progress against the torso to ensure that the cuts I was making were being done both in the correct location and also in the correct amounts. Once I was happy with how the right arm was fitting, I repeated the process on the left. Again, I compared this piece against the torso and also included the right arm as well to ensure that the left wrist was lining up properly. I continued until both arms were sitting nicely against the torso, but I didn't glue anything together just yet, as I still need to make some modifications to the arquebus. In order to better separate the final appearance of the Jezzail from the arquebus, I made a series of cuts. The first of these was to the muzzle brake at the end of the barrel. This changed the profile of the weapon somewhat and gave it a more simplistic appearance. Following on from this, I also clipped away the carrying handle and some of the details towards the rear of the rifle. These cuts were then smoothed out with a knife, and I was left with something that was a little less obvious about its Skitarii origins. After clipping and trimming, I then carefully drilled out the muzzle of the barrel using my pin vise, which meant that the rifle no longer looked like a fancy stick. The original Jezzails had small scope, so this would be my next addition. I started with the magazine section from a Primus Intercessor's Stalker bolt rifle. I then clipped away the scope from the rest of the components before cutting down the length of the scope a little bit too. This was followed by the careful removal of the raised sections of the scope and finally a cleaning up of any rough edges left by the clipping. The intention behind reducing the scope's length was to create something a little more Skaven looking. I had imagined that instead of a series of polished lenses, the scope would instead contain a section of roughly hewn warpstone instead. To create this, I started with some 3mm diameter plastic rod. With my scalpel, I whittled down the end into a very rough point to create the appearance of a shard of warpstone. I cut away the last few millimeters of this and then glued this to the end of the scope, completing my Clan Scryer devised optic. With the scope built, this was then glued to the rifle. You can place this wherever you feel, but I chose to attach it a little in front of the hand to give me some space for my next modification. Again, I wanted to further distance the Jezzail from the more highly crafted arquebus and thought that having the scope crudely lashed to the rifle would help to do this. I took some 28 gauge beading wire and bent it into a rough loop. I added a little superglue to this and hooked it onto the scope before giving it a chance to dry. With the wire glued in place, I began to wrap the wire around the rifle and the scope in a few loops. When I was happy with the number of passes made, I clipped the wire to length. More superglue was then added to more firmly attach the wire to the weapon. At this stage, I had finally completed the adjustments to the rifle, and I could now attach the arms to the Skaven's torso with some plastic glue. Although, after doing this, I was still left with a gap behind the left arm, which would need to be filled in. So I grabbed myself some green stuff and mixed the two halves together before pressing this into the gap behind the shoulder. I removed any excess and then smoothed out the green stuff with my sculpting tool, following the cloth and the armour that was already present. Just be sure to use plenty of water or Vaseline when you're working with green stuff to prevent it from sticking to your tools. Now normally I would suggest allowing the green stuff to cure before continuing, but as it was quite out of the way, I decided it didn't matter too much in this case. All that the gunner needed now was a head. I used a storm vermin head here, but straight from the sprue, it was a little too ornate, and some of the tufts of fur around the cheeks would prevent me from positioning the head how I wanted to. So these were first clipped away and then trimmed smooth. What I was left with was a head that could be glued so that it followed the line of the rifle rather than looking straight ahead. Now that I had the gunner, I then proceeded to build the second half of the team. I again started with a torso from the storm vermin sprue. Like before, I clipped, cleaned and then glued together one of the torsos. This particular Skaven is tasked with carrying the large shield, or Pavis. The original model used a large upside down triangle shaped shield, so naturally I wanted to create something similar. I began by removing 4 of the much smaller shields from the storm vermin kit. I laid these out to create a larger version of these and to check how they would fit together. I was surprised with how nicely these lined up with each other, but I did need to trim down some of the edges to remove some of the spikes and other raised details that would have gotten in the way. Once done, I brought in my glue and attached each of the shields to each other to create one big one. I gave this ample time to dry before progressing. Due to my choice of shields, I was left with a circular hole in the center. Fortunately, I still had some green stuff mixed, so I rolled this into a ball and pressed it into the gap so it protruded from the outer side of the shield. With the flat side of the sculpting tool, I added a few facets into the green stuff to create the appearance of a dented shield boss. This was then allowed to cure while I continued to assemble the Skaven carrying the Pavis. I started with the head. Once again, I took another storm vermin head and clipped away the ridge from the top of the helmet. To follow a similar pose to the Jezzail carrying Skaven, I also trimmed away some of the fur tufts from just the left hand side of the head. This allowed me to angle the head towards the left a little more. Following this, one of the blade carrying arms and an arm with an empty left hand were also glued to the torso. I then left the glue to dry and the green stuff to cure fully before moving on. Once everything had been allowed to set, I wanted to check that the position of the 2 Skaven crew members and the shield were lining up correctly. I did this with some blue tack and attached them to a 60mm oval base. This allowed me to see that the left foot of the rifle-toting Skaven needed to be slightly raised to allow the Jezzail to rest on the Pavis. This was achieved with some chunks of cork which had been ripped up from a cork floor tile. If you've seen any of my basing guides, you will already be familiar with this cheap and easily workable material. I ripped up a few chunks of the cork and added them around the base, placing one beneath where the back Skaven's left foot would be. After this, the team was finally brought together and everything was glued into place. All that needed to be done now was to continue the basing and to give everything a suitable paint scheme. And here we have the completed Warplock Jezzail team in plastic. My goal with this kitbash was to create something that was recognisable as being a Jezzail team whilst featuring more up-to-date sculpts. Additionally, I also aimed to keep the cost down as much as possible to make fielding these teams more economically viable. So let's break things down. 6 resin Jezzail teams will set you back £65, so that's the target to come under. I started with 20 storm vermin, which cost £32.50. This gives you plenty of bodies and heads, but with only 20 shields, you can build a maximum of 5 teams with them. But you can pick up 4 of these shields separately for about £1, bringing us to a total of £33.50. You do need to factor in the extra cost of the 5 pairs of arms with Transuranic Arquebus, which can be upwards of £5 each when bought separately, but you can always hack up a few cheaper galvanic rifles to make them longer, which would save some considerable money. So you're looking at about £6 for the rifles. 5 oval bases from Games Workshop are £3, so 2 packs of these, plus the rifles. Our total cost is £45.50 for enough parts to build 6 Warplock Jezzail teams, with enough parts left over to still build 8 Storm Vermin, or even more teams if you wanted to. So all in all, you're looking at a 30% cost reduction for a team that looks a little more up to date and is in plastic. It does take a little more work, but I'd much rather convert plastic than work with Finecast. If you enjoyed this Age of Sigmar kit bash, please do leave me a like along with the suggestions for other units you'd like to see me attempt to update in the future. And with that, the final thing to say is a massive thank you to my supporters. Currently, my top supporters on Patreon are Stuart Smith, Jeremy Kaup, Jake, Douglas Wilson, Daniel Dowling, Raphael Beiruthi, Lyconian Primarch, and Casper Strand. So a big thank you to you guys, and if you also support me on Patreon, buy me a coffee or you just use my affiliates links, and your help is what keeps this channel alive and it's what allows me to buy the kits required to build these conversions. If you would like to help me out, then you can check out my description for all of the relevant links. Until next time, thanks for watching and goodbye.